Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to talk about solving radical equations, and this will be our last section for radicals. So, when we solve radical equations, we need to treat the radical like a giant fancy x that we're solving for. Okay. So, solving radical equations. So, here I have the square root of x minus 3 equals 4. So, rule number 1, get the radical by itself. That's the very first thing you need to do. Get the radical by itself. It doesn't matter how big or small it is, get the radical by itself. So, I want to get all of this by itself. So, the opposite of subtracting 3 is adding 3. So, we're going to add 3 to both sides. So when we add 3 to both sides, we're left with the square root of x. It's equal to 7. Now that we have the radical by itself, the second rule is to undo the radical. So we talked about before, the inverse operation of square rooting is squaring. So we're going to square both sides. We're going to square both sides. The square and the square root will cancel each other out, and leaving us with just x. So we get x is equal to 49. Let's try again. Here I have the square root of x plus 1 minus 3 is equal to 2. Again, rule number 1, get the radical by itself. Rule number 1, get the radical by itself. So, anything outside of the radical we want to get rid of. So the opposite of subtracting 3 is adding 3. So we're going to add 3 to both sides. We have the radical by itself. Now the radical is by itself, we want to square both sides. We're squaring both sides. The square and the square root cancel each other out. So that leaves us with x plus 1 is equal to 25. We're going to subtract 1 from both sides, which gives us x is equal to 24. Our next equation. We have the square root of x plus 5 equals 3. Again, rule number 1, get the radical by itself. And when I subtract 5 from both sides, I get the square root of x is equal to negative 2. Okay. So here is where we can automatically stop. There is no solution for x. Now why is that? Why? Because anytime we take the square root of a number, it must always be a positive number. Always. It always must be a positive number. So anytime I have a square root symbol equal to a negative number, there will be no solution. Okay? It is a conflict of logic, because we know the square rooting a number must always be positive. It must always be positive. Number 4, the square root of x plus 6 equals 1. Again, we're going to subtract 6 from both sides. We get the square root of x is equal to a negative 5. That's right. X is equal to no solutions. There's no solution for x. How are we doing? Any questions? Okay. Number 5. Here we're solving for x. We have x on both sides. Okay, so what are we trying to do? We get the x by itself? Do we get the radical by itself? Okay, stick with, there's only one rule. Rule number 1. Get the radical by itself. Always, always, always get the radical by itself. So what do we need to do? We want to keep that square root of x plus 7 by itself. So that means we want to get rid of the plus 5. So what is the opposite of adding 5? Subtracting 5, yes. So we're going to subtract 5 from both sides. So I subtract 5 from both sides. Now I have x minus 5 is equal to the square root of x plus 7. I can see now that I have the square root by itself. So, once the square root is by itself, what do? That is right. We're going to square both sides. We square both sides once we have the radical by itself. We square both sides. On the right side, the square and the square root will cancel each other out. On the left side, we get a quadratic equation. So we have to use the FOIL method. I know, we've got to go back to your algebra. We use the FOIL method, first, outer, inner, last, because we know that x minus 5 quantity squared is the same as x minus 5 times x minus 5. So we multiply that out, and we get x squared minus 10x plus 25. Okay. Some of us may be a little stuck. So, ladies and gentlemen, we need to, let me clarify. So here, we get, this is the same thing as x minus 5 times x minus 5. And then we have to do the FOIL. Remember, we do the, where is it? First, outer, inner, last. Remember, we use the FOIL, and or you use the box. Some of you learned the box method, right? The x minus 5, x minus 5. So you're going to use either one of those methods, ladies and gentlemen, and you will get your x squared minus 10x plus 25. I hope that little algebra review came back to you. Next, from now, we want to get all the values on one side. So we're going to subtract x from both sides, and we're going to subtract 7 from both sides. So that gives us a negative 11x plus 7 plus 18 equals 0. Now that we have our quadratic equal to 0, we can use a couple of different methods. We can use the diamond method that you were taught in algebra. You can use the quadratic formula. You know, complete the square. I know there's all kind of methods that we learn. But let's use the diamond method. That was usually the easiest. So diamond method, we take the last value and the middle coordinate, the last coefficient and the middle coefficient, and we put those in our x, or our diamond. So we need to find two values that multiply to the top, and those same two values add to the bottom. We want two values that multiply to the top and add to the bottom. Yes, so negative 2 times negative 9 equals 18, and negative 2 plus negative 9 equals negative 11. Excellent. All right, so how does that help us? Well, we know we can factor. So what we have now are factors. We can use two factors. We have x minus 2 times the quantity of x minus 9. So each one of these factors will be equal to 0. So each set of parentheses could be equal to 0. And we can solve for x individually. So when we do that, x will equal 2 and x will equal 9. Because each one will be set equal to 0 because of the product rule. So x minus 2 has to equal 0, which means x equals 2. X minus 9 has to equal 0 by itself also, which means x equals 9. Let's do one more like this. So again, rule number 1, get the radical by itself. Get the radical by itself. So that means we need to get rid of that 10 right there. So the opposite of adding 10 is subtracting 10. So we're going to subtract 10 to both sides. Now we have x minus 10 is equal to the square root of x plus 10. So we have the radical by itself. Now that we have the radical by itself, we're going to do step 2. Step 2 is to square both sides. We're going to square both sides. We know on the right side, the square and the square root cancel each other out. On the left side, we have the quantity x minus 10 quantity squared. So that is the same as x minus 10 times x minus 10. So which gives us a quadratic. We want to set the equation equal to 0 in order to solve for x. So we're going to add x to both sides. We're going to get rid of these values right here. So we're going to add x to both sides. We're going to subtract x to both sides because x is positive. And we're going to subtract 10 from both sides so that we can make the equation equal to 0. So when we do that, now we have x squared minus 21x plus 90 is equal to 0. So now that we have a quadratic equation that we're solving for x, let's do the diamond method again. So we put the last term at the top and the middle coefficient at the bottom. Remember, we're trying to add. We want to add to a negative 21 and multiply to 90. Okay, so I'm looking for two numbers that will multiply to 90, and those same two numbers will add to a negative 21. What two numbers will multiply to 90 and add to a negative 21? So a negative 15 and 6, negative 6. So negative 15 times a negative 6 equals 90. And a negative 15 plus a negative 6 will give me a negative 21. Okay, so that lets us know we can have the factors x minus 15 times the quantity x minus 6. Both of those parentheses can be set equal to 0 separately. So x minus 15 equals 0, which would give us x is equal to a positive 15. And x minus 6 will be equal to 0, will give us x is equal to 6. Excellent. Good job, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for listening.